Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So Saturday night, Pierre Poilievre won the Conservative leadership with 68% on the first ballot. It was an astounding feat for someone who thought that they would win, but 68% is an incredible amount. And Jean Charest, former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, former premier, Quebec premier, came in second with, I think it was 16%. Lots of people were suggesting that this was really a fight between the right and the center of the political spectrum within the Conservative Party, between progressive conservatives and more right-wing populist, maybe even some people think extremist conservatives. But it doesn't seem to have been so. It seems like Pierre Poilievre and that right wing won an incredibly resounding victory. So what does this mean for the Conservative Party? What does it mean for Canadian politics? What does it mean for the center, as some people think the Conservative Party has moved to the right and the Liberal Party has moved to the left? And is anyone in the middle of the political spectrum representing where some people think the majority of Canadians actually are? That's something we're going to discuss today. We're going to have two guests: Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe Strategy, and Warren Kinsella of the Daisy Group. Stay with us for just a second, and we're going to be joined by Rick Anderson. Rick Anderson, the principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, has joined us. He's a commentator on Canadian politics and has been for quite a long period of time. He worked for the leader of the Reform Party, Preston Manning, in the past, and he's been tweeting quite a bit and commenting quite a bit over the course of the whole campaign, but also this past weekend. Rick, we just let our audience, reminded our audience that Pierre Poilievre won a resounding victory on Saturday night. Tell me what your reaction is. How's this going to impact the Conservative Party? How's it going to impact Canadian politics?
Well, obviously, Brian, good morning. Thanks for letting me chat with you. We always have fun when we do this.
I enjoy it.
Obviously, when the opposition party, the main opposition party, the official opposition in Canada, chooses a new leader, it's a big deal. This is the person most likely positioned to become the Prime Minister at the next time Canadians get a chance to decide whether or not they want to change. So it changes the whole structure of federal politics. There's no question about that. And of course, Pierre has had a really strong, resounding kind of victory amongst the members of the Conservative Party. So he goes into it, loaded for bear.
Were you surprised at how strong the victory was? 68%, I believe.
Not in the end. I wasn't. I mean, the signs were there all the way through the campaign. The crowds and everything else, the momentum he was enjoying throughout. I'm distressed, though, that such polarizing messaging is getting such a fervent response from within the ranks of the Conservative Party, and concern for the country, because it's not a road I think we should be going down. So I think that Pierre has his work cut out for him to translate his intra-party mandate to something that everyday Canadians can relate to. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I'm saying it's going to be tough. And he's going to also face what other people have faced, which is kind of a feeling of perhaps the feeling of having said certain things in order to get elected, and now with one group, and now saying something slightly different in order to broaden his appeal with a larger group. I don't know if that's what he's going to do. I think he needs to, and if he wants to win an election in this country, but that remains to be seen whether he agrees with that or not.
But he seems to have really connected with a segment of Canadian population that have joined the Conservative Party, maybe people that haven't been active party activists in the past, maybe not even have voted in elections in the past, whether they be anti-vaxxers or people that are really focused on the freedom mantra that he was speaking about. Could he actually be elected not moving to the center, not pivoting to the center, and frankly just keeping his current what you described as maybe extreme positioning?
Maybe. I happen to believe that Trumpism is one of the greatest challenges that Western democracies have faced in the history of Western democracies. And what I mean by Trumpism is a very negative kind of approach to politics, to leadership, which intentionally drives wedges often misinforms people, gets their anger up by telling them things that are half true or sort of partly true, but not quite the way you said them, and so on, and feeds the natural divisions that exist in society. Through most of the last couple of hundred years of democratic leadership, people have tried harder to bring people together to form consensus around ideas, around policies, around solutions to problems that are broadly supported, and done so by, first of all, informing people accurately as to what's going on and what the range of options are, and not just throwing mud around. I mean, it's basically just to take one. You mentioned vaccines, and I think that's a big deal, and Freedom Convoy, and so on, et cetera. We can get into that if you want, although it's well plowed ground already. But just to take something on the economic front that's probably more relevant to most Canadians right now. The idea that we've got just inflation in Canada, meaning inflation that's principally fed by Justin Trudeau and by the Liberal government, by its policies, is inaccurate. Everybody in the world is facing the inflation crisis that we've got here. And in fact, Canada's version of it is a little bit milder. And the solutions, he seems to be, well, he's never really offered a solution to it.
Sure, he has. Fire the governor of the Bank of Canada.
Pardon?
Sure, he has. Fire the governor of the Bank of Canada.
Right. So every country should go around and fire its central bankers, because we've all got versions of this inflation. I mean, that's not, that's not really a solution, nor is the idea that something like Bitcoin represents an opt-out from inflation. I mean, since the time he was advocating for Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin has dropped 60%. So, I mean, of course, that's not inflation, but people would have lost a ton of money if they'd taken any advice from what he was saying about that at the time. These are not actual solutions.
Well,
and we're going to have to get to actual solutions, and not just ones which are, calling the Bank of Canada economic illiterates or other central bankers around the world, or pretending that international gatherings like the World.
I've lost you. Did you hit?
Okay.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second, Rick. You were saying something about the World Economic Forum?
Well, I was just saying, Mr. Poilievre, of course, made strong statements about the World Economic Forum and conspiracy theories allegedly that it's allegedly pursuing, and so on. I think that's mostly nonsense. Whether it's the World Economic Forum or G7 meetings or G20 meetings or any number of international conferences that Canadians go to, we go to them because it's how we further our international trade and economic relationships, and they're valuable in that regard. I mean, the government he was part of, led by Mr. Harper, was successful in, first of all, being present at World Economic Forums. Ministers, the Prime Minister, and various cabinet ministers were regular attendees, and they used that and other conferences like that to help further Canada's goals in terms of trade relationships. We're one of the biggest trading nations in the world. Prime Minister Harper signed more trade agreements than any prime minister in Canadian history. You don't do this by hiving yourself off in a corner and saying, I don't want to talk to these other people.
So let's talk about this for a second, if we could. The World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, that the World Economic Forum has spoken about for the last, maybe year and a half.
Well, or that was referenced in one or two essays.
Is something that there's a reasonable segment of society in Canada, the United States, et cetera, believe really, and whether it's a conspiracy theory or a fear or what, for some strange reason, actually believe we're trying to run the world, run the economy,
right,
and do it in a way that we've lost sovereignty to the World Economic Forum. What is this? Is this a populist conspiracy theory, a populist concern, a policy plank? Where does this fear, this concern come from? And why does it resonate with so many people? And if what you say is true, that we're a great trading nation, and that the Conservative government previously under Stephen Harper, really was supportive of a lot of these efforts, how can a current leader use this argument and be supported by so many people, and so many reasonable people that have historically been leaders within the Conservative Party?
Well, these are excellent questions, Brian. you reap what you sow in politics. If you tell people that these things are occurring, that there's a conspiracy theory that wants you to just stay home and not work in the future, and that we need population control, and that Bill Gates wants to install a microchip in all of our brains so he can track our every thought. If you tell people that, some people are going to believe it, and then they're going to start acting on that belief. Lots of people have spent lots of time trying to analyze what exactly is driving this torrent of misinformation that you can find online, whether it's on YouTube or Twitter or wherever. Whether how much is it actually being sown by foreign actors, which is a code phrase meaning Russia and China and so on, people who really don't want democracies to succeed. Is it orchestrated by domestic politics? It's probably not orchestrated. That's the wrong word to use. But it's certainly got a lot of people repeating these things. And you can chase them all day long and say, look, that's not true. Right now, we've got people claiming that there are school boards putting out litter boxes for kids who identify as animals to use in place of regular washrooms. This has been, denied time and time again. It keeps showing up. Even here in Canada, people claim there are petitions around school boards to have this thing happening. People are actually putting out lies. So most of the people who repeat them assume they're not lies. They think somebody's telling them something that's real, but it's not. And the World Economic Forum conspiracy theories fall into that category as well. And responsible leaders should not be repeating them.
But isn't this different? What you've described is conspiracy theories that are out there on the web. Here you've got the leader of the second largest party, actually won the popular vote in the last election. It was the party that actually was the birth to Canada. If the Conservative Party is the continuation of the Progressive Conservative Party, which is the continuation of the Conservative Party, that has not only given lip service to it, but has repeated it. And you've got mainstream conservatives that have been active within their party for a long period of time, that even though Pierre Poilievre has been talking about these World Economic Forum conspiracy theories that you rightly suggest are nuts, they voted for him and they're supportive of him. And I've spoken to several people this weekend and they've said, yeah, but he's going to win power. And this is the best way to win power. So that they seem to accept that he's giving voice to the fringe right or the fringe conspiracy theories, but he won't do anything about it, or he won't follow through with it or something. Like they're believing almost that he's lying.
People as far back as, Karl Marx and so on, and the Chinese today have long predicted that democracy would be its own suicide agent, that it would kill itself, that eventually democracies would fail because people would not be responsible in terms of the execution of it. Now, I don't want to accuse Pierre of that. I hope that what he's going to do here is temper some of what he's saying, for sure, and stay away from misinforming people about things like the WEF or Bitcoin and so on, and come forward with reasonable solutions. But that's not exactly what he did in his leadership campaign. And we all know that, to the farther right of the Conservative Party in the country, there's a thing called the People's Party of Canada, which I think he's probably done a very good job at dragging supporters out of. And Max Bernier is probably the person who needs to be most concerned in this country right now about what it means for their leadership, more concerned than Justin Trudeau needs to be. But even further right than that, are the people that we saw in the so-called Freedom Convoy, who were busy basically in the middle of a pandemic saying, they had the right to just basically go where they wanted to, vaccinated or not. And no government had the right to try to ensure public safety and so on, even though most Canadians supported reasonable measures to make us all safe and have us get through that pandemic in comparatively healthier ways than most countries in the world, certainly most G7 countries. I think Pierre ran a lot of his leadership campaign at PPC supporters and obviously the Freedom Convoy. There was an interesting poll I don't want to misattribute it here, so I guess I better not attribute it because I'll say it was Angus Reid or somebody, but I don't, and maybe it may have been Leger, but it was about Bitcoin. And it showed that people who supported the PPC and the Green Party, ironically, who are also kind of vaguely libertarian in their impulses, were the ones most likely to believe that Bitcoin represented a solution to inflation. Whereas Conservative Party supporters, Conservative Party voters, and Liberal Party voters and NDP voters all rejected it like 90 to 10, 85 to 15 kind of thing. But over there on the PPC side of things, and weirdly on the Green Party, which is very small, well, those are both very small cohorts, the idea that Bitcoin represented kind of a solution to inflation was actually well espoused. So we have these pockets of receptivity to these kind of messages. It doesn't matter that most people will look at it and say, well, that's just, how is this supposed to be true? What would I even do if I believe this to be true? Go buy Bitcoin? How is that going to make my groceries less expensive? They know it's not. Their instincts are, most people's instincts are, this is not true. Most experts will tell you it's completely not true. So we have these pockets where people nurture these ideas and are very receptive when somebody comes along and starts to champion them. And if we go down that road, those people who say democracy will be its own, its own enemy at the end of the day, are going to turn out to be right. We need to pull back and start, Mr. Poilievre needs to pull back and start thinking harder about ways to build consensus around real solutions that he can implement if he forms government in the country.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson about the victory on Saturday night by Pierre Poilievre as leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. We're going to take a quick break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with more of Rick Anderson on Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party, and frankly, on democracy in Canada. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Saturday night, Pierre Poilievre won the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada with I was shocked, resounding 68% to, I think it was 13% for the second running Jean Charest. Rick, I've interviewed people in the Conservative Party. I've interviewed some of the leadership candidates. I've interviewed other commentators, and some have said, don't worry, Pierre Poilievre is going to pivot to the center. It's what conservatives always do and what liberals, frankly, do. They campaign to the right or to the left, and then they pivot to the center. And then I've had other people say, yeah, but that's what Aaron O'Toole tried to do. And when he did the pivot, people lost trust in where he stood. So what do you think? Can Pierre Poilievre actually pivot to the center?
That's a good question, and it wasn't just Aaron O'Toole had that problem. It was also Patrick Brown in Ontario when he won the leadership. And then some groups, particularly social conservatives, started to get angry with him because he was eschewing some of the policies in which they thought he'd run and been elected. We've got a bit of a tradition of this now on the right side of Canadian politics. And as you point out, it's not just conservatives who sometimes campaign a certain way and then do something else in office. And honestly, I'm old enough, so are you, Brian, to remember the 1984 election. I'd run Don Johnson's Liberal leadership campaign that year, and I helped Mr. Turner after he won that leadership race and became the prime minister. And in the 1984 election, as you recall, the Royal Commission on Canada's economic process, Don MacDonald, had reported and controversially suggested that Canada should seek a free trade agreement with the United States. Well, in the 1984 election, I know this is ancient history, but it's a good instruction, and people don't. It's a good memory for people to think back at. In the 84 election, Liberal leader, the Liberal Party, and John Turner campaigned heavily in favor of free trade, and the Conservative Party and Brian Mulroney campaigned heavily against it. And Mulroney, of course, won that particular election for a lot of reasons. It didn't particularly have anything to do with free trade, and changed his mind in office. Met with President Reagan, and they decided, yes, it was maybe worth exploring. And by the time we got to the next election, the 88 election, we had negotiated a free trade agreement. Brian Mulroney's government had done so and obviously supported it and advocated it. And John Turner and the Liberal Party decided they were going to flip their position and oppose it. And they ran those ads showing the Canadian border being wiped out and claiming Medicare would be, the free trade would be the end of Medicare and so on. Of course, they were exaggerating all of that, and most people in both of those parties would today agree that free trade is one of the most positive economic things we've done in the last 30 or 40 years. So it's not unusual for governments or opposition parties to advocate positions for or against certain things and then to change their mind once they're in power. And I think Pierre is smart enough to know that he can't run the country on the basis of the ideas he was putting out during the leadership campaign. Maybe he should change the Bank of Canada governor. I'm not saying that people need to have those positions forever. I'm not saying he should change them either, because I don't think the inflation problem we've got is particularly their problem or particularly their fault. But I think he's smart enough to realize what he's going to have to do as a prime minister is certainly not what he campaigned on, and probably what he's going to have to do as the opposition leader is not quite what he campaigned on during the Conservative Party leadership. I think he understands that. So, I mean, we can call it a pivot if you want, or an evolution, but I think he's probably going to evolve as positions to become more mainstream. I certainly hope he does. And I do think that Canadians are quite tired of the incumbent government. I mean, I think the next election has all the potential in the world to be a real horse race. So therefore, the positions of the Conservative opposition are going to be quite important. The election could probably turn on whether or not those are seen by Canadians to be attractive and whether or not they've actually formed the basis of a governing approach after that next election. I'm not, I could today not flip a coin. I would have to flip a coin to say who I think is going to win the next election, next federal election in Canada.
Well, I have to tell you, when you use the reference to Trump, I was convinced that the Republican Party would turn away from Trump, and that he was a joke, and that whether it be with the whole Russian involvement in the initial election or January 6th and whatever it was in the issue, I was convinced that smart Republicans, a lot who I do business with and know, some that I'm related to, would realize how nuts the man was and how inappropriate as a leader of a country, but they didn't. And still, what is it? 80% or something like that of the Republican Party believe that Trump won the last election. So that there seems to be a unbelievable ability of mainstream people in regular major parties to believe falsehoods, to believe conspiracy theories. And if that's true in the United States, why can't it be true in Canada? And, lots of people have pointed out that while the majority of Canadians got vaccines and the majority of Canadians believed that COVID-19 was real and did the appropriate things with physical distancing as well, there were 15% of the people that supported, 15% of Canadians based on polls that supported the truck convoy, the call for freedom, didn't think that vaccine passports, mandates, physical distancing mandates, et cetera, mask mandates, et cetera, were at all appropriate. 15%. Is a large number of people. And a lot of them either supported the PCP, as you pointed out, or maybe didn't vote. And if Pierre Poilievre can motivate them to get out and vote, that's going to be the margin of victory.
It will be, and look, I used to say that I thought Pierre was one of the smartest people in the House of Commons and certainly one of its best communicators. I thought his speeches in the House have tended to be quite strong. That was before the leadership campaign. And I now think, reflect on the fact that the term smart has different meanings. I think Pierre has shown us he's clever, but I'm not sure that he's shown us he's wise. And he is nonetheless a terrific communicator. And if he turns his communication skills towards telling people things that are less than completely honest or less than completely accurate, or not viable as solutions for the country, and they believe him, we could end up really in a bad place. And I agree with you about what you're saying with respect to Donald Trump. I found it incredible that he would be nominated the first time. I found it incredible that Americans would elect him. I realized that they were very frustrated with the Clintons, and particularly with Hillary Clinton, that she was a weak candidate, et cetera, et cetera. But, having seen 4 years of Trump and all the mess that was created, and the divisions that were created and so on, I am really shocked that people would even contemplate voting for him again. I mean, of course they did in 2022, 2020. But to me, it's just unbelievable, because he's just completely ill-suited, and it's not even necessarily on the basis of policy A or B, although he's got lots of crazy ideas on the policy front. But it's not even the policy side of it. It's just his whole temperament is so wrong for trying to lead a population forward in a constructive fashion. I mean, and to try to get people working together instead of fighting with each other. I mean, he just is he's a divider, and Pierre Poilievre ran that kind of a leadership campaign. I sure hope he's not going to run that kind of election campaign. And I hope that Canadians will not give anybody with that sort of approach an opportunity to govern. So I hope he pivots or evolves, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm counting on him doing so, but we'll see.
Rick, I'm not sure what your politics are today. I used to know you in the Liberal Party, and then you ended up being in the Reform Party and very supportive of more right-wing conservative causes. I personally am a fiscal conservative and a social progressive, and I like Jean Charest. I was very attracted to a lot of his policies, and frankly, in a race between Jean Charest and Justin Trudeau, I'm not sure where I would have landed. I was shocked that he only won 13%. On Saturday night. Here's a gentleman that was Captain Canada during the Quebec referendum, someone that ran the Quebec province, so executive experience, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party at one point in time, one of only two conservatives to win in which election was it? I can't remember now, that the Mulroney government, Kim Campbell, the new prime minister, went down to massive defeat. And the fact that he could actually withstand that trend against conservatives, it's got to say something.
I supported John, the leadership campaign, Jean Charest, and I think he's a fine guy.
Why didn't he resonate?
Well, he didn't resonate for some of the reasons that we've been talking about. I mean, they said he was a liberal. There is, until now, there was no conservative party in Quebec, not for decades. There hasn't been. And so, of course, there's many of the people who are federally conservative are provincially in Quebec liberals. Same thing is true in BC, where I live these days. There is no conservative party, no provincial conservative party to speak of in BC. But where you find federal conservative voters is supporting the provincial Liberal Party, or in the old days, the Social Credit Party. That's the nature of Canadian politics. The Conservative Party doesn't really have provincial cousins in two of the three largest provinces in the country. And that's always been a problem for it in terms of forming majority government. It takes a real strong leader with an ability to attract significant Quebec support for a conservative to become prime minister of this country. But to ask you didn't really ask me about my politics today. I call myself an independent. I like you, I'm consider myself an economic conservative, not just on fiscal policy, but in terms of market-oriented policies and so on, competition-oriented policies and freer markets and so on, freer trade and so on. Balanced budgets are better than huge deficits and debt. Lower taxes are better than higher taxes, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's all fairly clear and empirically provable. But at the same time, I think Canadians value and our governments value, a well-functioning healthcare system, which is not necessarily the one we've got right now. I think a lot of people believe, I certainly believe, we've got some significant problems to solve with respect to our healthcare system and shortage of the gatekeepers, who are the way most people have to access the system, which is, not showing up at emergency, but through your family doctor. We have millions of Canadians who don't have a family doctor and can't find one because there's a shortage of them. That's a pretty serious problem. And I think conservatives need to come forward with some solutions to that: housing problems, Indigenous reconciliation, and so on. But I think Canadians are looking for practical solutions to those things that are not off on some far left part of the ideological, left-wing kind of politics, but neither are they kind of a right-wing knee-jerk rejection of those things, and it's every person for themselves. I don't think that's where Canadians are really at. So, I mean, if you want to call that socially progressive and fiscally conservative, that's a phrase that I wouldn't reject. But I think it's more nuanced than that. I mean, for today, the environment is another big important issue. It doesn't really fall into left versus right, although people tend to sometimes think it does. I mean, I do a lot of work in the energy sector. Most of the big energy companies in this country, oil companies, oil sands companies, natural gas companies, hydro utilities, and so on, actually have promised and are reducing their emissions, and they're signed on, many of them, to net zero 2050 and net zero emissions in 2050. And they're looking for stability in government policy that will help provide an ongoing framework where they can make the investments in things like carbon capture and hydrogen and small modular reactors and so on, that are part of the path to getting to net zero emissions in 2050. And in that sector, if we start another big fight that goes on for 5 years of redoing our policy framework and so on, we're going to chill a lot of investment in one of our most important sectors of the economy. So we need to be careful how we proceed here. It's not as simple as left versus right. I think, the test you need to make with public policy is also just pragmatism. What works? What is it that we can do with dental care or healthcare or the environment to get the best possible outcome with housing policy and so on? And usually it's some hybrid. This is, I think, a Canadian trait, some hybrid of public goals and private investors and private entrepreneurship. That's most of how we've built the country since the days of the National Railway. And I think that's really our solution in the future. And, sometimes conservative governments offer that more effectively than liberal governments, and sometimes it's the other way around.
But Rick, I listened to all the conservative debates. I followed the different candidates. The last couple of minutes of the in-depth policy discussion that you just spoke about was vacant, wasn't there in the conservative leadership. And you've said, and let me ask you, are you really truthfully worried about the state of democracy? That's what you said you were.
Yes, I am. I think we've seen over the last 30 years, and so I'm intentionally picking a longer time frame. I mean, I don't think this is about Trudeau or Poilievre or even Trump. It's been a long time. It's been since the mid-90s that an American Democratic president and a Republican Congress, Clinton and Gingrich, were able to come together and agree on how to balance the U.S. budget. That's 30 years. And what's gone on in the meantime in the States, but also in Britain over Brexit, and here in Canada over what we're talking about, the pandemic and so on, energy policy to a large degree, we've managed to polarize these issues so that they're black and white instead of more complex and nuanced. The first politician in this country to close a coal-fired electricity plant was a guy by the name of Mike Harris. And he did it because it was polluting the air over Toronto and Lake Ontario, and there were air quality advisories. You'll remember this well. Daily in the morning, you wake up in the morning, look out, see the brown sky over Lake Ontario, and the radio weather report would tell you should probably stay indoors that day or get out of the city at least. So he closed that because of pollution. But what was interesting about it is what happened next, which is that all three parties in the Ontario legislature got together within a year, like this is 2001, 2002, if I recall correctly. And the three parties all agreed in the legislature to close the rest of Ontario's coal fleet. And the subsequent election in which Dalton McGuinty was elected, all three parties campaigned on doing that, but on slightly different timeframes. I think Mr. McGuinty's was about 8 years, and Ernie Eves was talking about 12 years. And in the end, McGuinty won that election, of course, and he did close the rest of the fleet, but it took him 12 or I think 14 years from the beginning, from the closure of that first plant. So the point of that story is to remind everybody the three parties had to come to terms with that. They had to get together and agree on that, and they had to get together and agree on how to replace the power that would be lost when you close those coal plants. And you remember there was a lot of controversy about wind and solar and feed-in tariffs and all of that kind of stuff. 20 years later, where we are today, there isn't that controversy anymore. That wind and solar power that was so expensive back then, unsustainably expensive, is no longer that expensive. And in fact, it's making an everyday contribution to our economic well-being, not just in Ontario, but in most provinces in Canada. And it's probably set to increase that contribution. So the point is that conservative leaders can actually be part of these solutions, particularly when they bring their mind to sort of making sure the economics of it work, and then it's economically sustainable and keeps our competitiveness healthy internationally. That's what you have to, in my mind, that's what you have to do. And that's a lot more complicated than simply saying axe the tax.
So given Pierre Poilievre's election, given it sounds like you think he'll move to the center, but given that you're worried about Canadian democracy and that he has used some extremist language and appealed to some conspiracy theorists believers, are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of Canada right now? I'm
worried. I guess I'm an optimist by nature, so I'll pick that side of that two multiple choice question. I think that Canadian voters are basically pretty commonsensical, looking for the best things, mostly open-minded and constructive. So I think that's how democracy works. And when the voters are that way, democracy does work, and it provides a much better system of government than all the alternatives, as people have said before. But when people just fall to polarizing and fighting with things and being angry and and throwing people out rather than thinking about what we're going to do next, we can talk ourselves into some pretty dark places. And I don't want to make any of those illusions that people draw upon so fast. But I mean, I'll make one, but I'm not saying this is what's happening today. Germany was a functioning democracy when Hitler took power. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen here. I'm just saying that we can go off the rails in democracies. And when we do, it can have pretty terrible consequences. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to have that sort of consequence here, but we should just not take this for granted. People need to be serious about this. They need to pay attention to what their leaders are offering them. They need to question whether or not they're being honest. They need to ask them whether or not they can get along with other people. Because life is just not as simple as saying it's my way or the highway. I mean, governments have to work together, or else we don't get transit projects done. We don't get pipeline projects done. And when people fight over them, we need to find solutions. And to do that, we need to have leaders who actually know how to work together and to find compromises.
Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us your impressions of what the victory by Pierre Poilievre means to the Conservative Party and to Canada. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
We're going to take a break. We'll be back in just 2 minutes, and I'm going to be joined by Warren Kinsella, another Canadian public policy commentator, and hear what he has to say about the election. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about the election of Pierre Poilievre as leader of the Conservative Party on Saturday night. We just heard some impressions from Rick Anderson of what he thought about the election, what it means for Canada, what it means for the Conservative Party. We're now being joined by Warren Kinsella of Daisy Group, another Canadian public policy, public affairs company, and Warren, another very frequent commentator on Canadian politics, has joined us. Warren, what do you think the election of Jean Charest means for both the Conservative Party of Canada as well as Canada itself?
The election of Pierre Poilievre?
Yes.
Yeah, because Charest didn't even come close. I think it means all kinds of things. The first being that the old Conservative Party, the Conservative Party of Mulroney and Clark and Campbell, that party is gone for good. So the one that could claim to have, at least, if not in its name, in its principles, some progressive principles, I think that party is gone. What is the consequence of that? It surprises me. As you and I have talked about before, Trudeau and Singh did this deal. I call it the axis of weasels, and they basically took the Liberal Party of Canada and moved it far over to the left. And it just, like Brian, it created a bunch of real estate in the middle for a centrist party to come along and snap up a whole bunch of suburban urban votes. And instead of doing that, Poilievre actually started chasing Maxime Bernier's gang, his vote. And there might be some value to going after the People's Party vote, were it not for the fact that the People's Party has never won a seat in Parliament, Bernier himself included. And in most cases, those candidates in the People's Party don't even get their deposit back. So it makes sense to me that the Conservative Party has abandoned some progressive conservative principles and abandoned the center. The second thing I think it means is that we're going to have a pretty nasty election campaign when it happens. I think the main job that the Conservative delegates gave to Conservative voters gave to Poilievre is they're like, we like you because you hate Justin Trudeau, and we hate Justin Trudeau too, so we want you to just go after Trudeau. That's a mistake. I'm no fan of Trudeau myself, but the Conservatives have underestimated this guy, Brian, 3 elections in a row. And he may not be the greatest prime minister, but he is a hell of a campaigner. And I think, you would think that they would have learned by now the danger in underestimating Justin Trudeau. But it looks like they're doing it again. They're already picking out the drapes for the Langevin block. And it's like, guys, I think if Trudeau sticks around, he's going to be sticking around because he thinks he can beat Pierre Poilievre. And I think he probably could.
Why does this incredible, extreme, right-wing, almost at times conspiracy theory believing segment be able to take over the Conservative Party?
Well, it's happening all over the place. 2 weeks ago, I was campaigning again for the Democrats in the United States. And, the Republican Party down there, much like the new Conservative Party up here, like Brian, they've just kind of run far to the right. And, with the Republicans, what I got at the door is, the January 6th stuff, the efforts to overturn the election results, and the abortion issue. All of those have hurt the Republican cause. Biden was heading for an absolute pounding in November, and that's not as certain as it was because the Republicans just went too far out, even for some of their own voters. It's the same risk, I think, that the Conservative Party is placed on its shoulders after their weekend convention, is picking a guy who's angry, who is kind of, pro-trucker, he's not kind of, he is, anti-vaccine. A lot of the stuff that Canadians support, Poilievre is against, and a lot of the things he's for, they're against. And that's not me saying that, that's what the polls are saying. So, I think there was an opportunity for the Conservatives to just tack it back just a little bit to the center. I'm not talking about them, nationalizing banks and stuff like that, but they didn't. They went further to the right. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to run back to the center.
Some people, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, were thinking that Jean Charest and or people that were more progressive conservatives would actually have an opportunity to create their own party. But with only a 13% result, that doesn't seem to be at all a possibility. What do you think? Is there a possibility for a new political party of the center? Will the Conservative Party fragment again? Will the Liberals move dramatically to the center? What's the right thing to happen, do you think?
Well, I think they fragmented already. I had the great fortune, as you know, working for Mr. Chrétien. I was his special assistant. I was on his staff when the Conservative Party did this. They went off into the Reform Party and into the Bloc Québécois and the Progressive Conservatives. They really didn't split into two, they split into three. And, I think Mr. Chrétien would have beaten the single Conservative Party handily had they stayed. But obviously, we were helped by the fact the Conservative Party had split up. Here, the Conservative Party hasn't split up formally. Charest or Brown haven't announced that, they're forming a new political party. I don't think that they will. But there's no question what Poilievre has said to the supporters of Charest and Brown, who tend to be more centrist conservatives: you're not wanted. You're liberals. Like, he was calling them names for 7 months and defaming them and demeaning them and making them feel unwelcome. Not just Charest and Brown, but Charest and Brown supporters. And so I think there's a constituency out there that's there for the taking for a smart conservative leader. But I think, Poilievre has decided, as you pointed out, to chase the Bernier People's Party vote. And, he's now kind of stuck to that.
There were 15% of Canadians, according to most polls, that supported the truck convoy, the Freedom Convoy, the occupation, whatever you wanted to call it, which is a sizable segment of the population. It's not a plurality or majority, but 15% is a lot. 8% or so, I can't remember, supported Maxime Bernier and the PCP, maybe not the last election, but 2 elections ago. If he motivates a whole bunch of people that didn't vote before, can he win with this right-wing, extreme right-wing position?
No, I don't think so, because we're just not the United States. And, there was a Nanos poll, and Nanos is an excellent polling agency. And it came out just a few days ago saying that 70% of Canadians disapproved of any politician who became too close to the convoy thing. Whether you were unhappy about vaccine mandates and public health measures and so on, there was a lot of Canadians say, I don't like this convoy. And so, I think what the Liberal War Room is going to do, and there's some very creative, very capable people in there. We can compose together right now, what the spot will look like. It'll be, Ottawa, January 2022, and some minor chords being played. And then there's going to be a shot of the statue of Terry Fox being defaced. And then there's going to be a shot of the war memorial being urinated on. And then there's going to be shots of these trucker people and convoy people screaming at the citizens of Ottawa for wearing masks and abusing them and defecating in public. And then it's going to cut. I think you can do this in 30 seconds. And then it's going to cut to a picture of Pierre Poilievre sitting there beside the leaders of this group, laughing and bringing them coffee. So that's just one issue. So that's the Conservative Party of Canada giving up on the law and order theme, because I now think that they've done that, but also associating Poilievre with extremism in a credible way. I know that the Liberal Party always attempts to do that. They tried with O'Toole, but it really wasn't man. They tried with Scheer, didn't really work. He was also a decent person. It will work with Poilievre, I believe, if they execute it properly, because he has associated with elements of the far right, with extremists, and Canadians don't like that stuff.
But Warren, in a debate, Dr. Leslie Ann Lewis attacked him for not supporting the truck convoy enough. When Jean Charest ridiculed and disagreed with him, he was booed. The Conservative Party, at least the people that showed up in those rallies and at their debates, are completely not where you've described 70% of Canadians are.
Yeah, and that's the problem. That's not a good position to be in when you're heading into an election campaign. They are out of step in the way that I described the Republicans are in the United States. They're out of step with the views of Canadians. And, Canadians believe in legitimate protests. They believe there were some things that happened, obviously, in the pandemic they didn't like, made them angry, made them sad, made them upset. But we are a country of peace, order, and good government. When people get reminded of what took place in Ottawa and at our border crossings, like in just Windsor alone, $1 billion worth of trade, $1 billion being taken out of our economy, the economy that Pierre Poilievre professes to be preoccupied with every day. Like that kind of stuff is going to hurt the Conservatives, and Leslyn Lewis, she's just this marginal person. I think she's part of this fringe right, and she's a bit of a kook. So, hopefully Poilievre doesn't spend a lot of time listening to people, but I suspect he's probably going to listen to her a lot more than he listens to Jean Charest.
Aaron O'Toole, the former leader of the Conservative Party, ran in the leadership from the right and attracted Leslie Ann Lewis and other right-wing candidates to support him in the ultimate victory that he had. But then he pivoted to the center, and he was criticized for that pivot. Can Pierre Poilievre pivot to the center?
No, and for the very reason you point out, like I did another panel on Sunday morning, the vote. And by the way, they were stupid for going ahead with the vote. On the weekend, the Queen dies and the new king gets announced. Like how they expected to get the kind of coverage that they wanted. It was just dumb. All they needed to do is wait a few days. But that is symptomatic of their judgment, is that they are out of sync with not just the news media. Those of us in the news media had to pay attention to the fact that our head of state had died and we've got a new one, and everything's going to change from our currency to the names of some Republicans. There's the Conservative Party kind of doubling down on elements, some policy elements that Canadians consider objectionable. And I think when Canadians pay attention to the new Conservative Party, they're going to say it'll be something like, you know what, I'm sick of Trudeau. I don't like the guy. I turn off the TV when he comes on, but I dislike this Poilievre guy even more because he just seems kind of angry and he seems like he doesn't even like the country. And I think we've got a pretty good country. I think that's going to be kind of the frame in the election.
We're chatting tonight with Warren Kinsella of Daisy Group about the election of Pierre Poilievre as leader of the Conservative Party on Saturday. We're going to take a final break for some messages. We'll be back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson and now with Warren Kinsella of Daisy Group about Pierre Poilievre winning the Conservative leadership on Saturday night. And the impact on both the Conservative Party as well as on the impact of Canada. Warren, I should tell you that Rick Anderson, before you joined, said he was worried about democracy and that the election of Pierre Poilievre really concerned him, and actually went back to Marx and said that lots of different commentators in political science, political history have said that democracy can lead to its own downfall, and worried about that. From a Republican Party standpoint in the United States and now from a Conservative Party standpoint in Canada. I got to say that I think it was Sunday morning, I read a post that you posted on Twitter. And I was really taken aback by how frank, how cutting, well, let me just read it and then ask you what the reaction people have had to what Warren Kinsella said on Sunday morning. He said, has never had an achievement when he had power. Says Indigenous people are lazy. Says racist stuff like tar baby. Promotes Bitcoin and then Bitcoin collapses. Opposes abortion for years and says he'll let Conservative MPs bring forward laws to outlaw abortion. Attacks public servants who can't defend themselves and says he will be a gatekeeper over the language they use. Promotes World Economic Forum conspiracies when he's attended WEF events himself. Poses for chummy photographs with white supremacists and far-right trucker convoy types. Defames his opponents in the leadership race and divides the party that he proposes to lead. Doesn't grow the Conservative voter base in any way. Otherwise, he's just great. That was a pretty, I don't know how to say,
it wasn't subtle. It wasn't subtle. Well, no, I'm not a subtle guy, and we've known each other for a long time. What I am, Brian, as you know, perhaps your viewers don't know, your listeners don't know, I'm a war room guy. So, war rooms get talked about a lot. I did the first Canadian political war room in '93 for Mr. Chrétien. And what we do is we take things that people have forgotten about or things that they didn't know, like that list that you just read. And we tell them stories about our opponent. And we tell stories that are unhelpful to the opponent. All of those things that you've related, they maybe make conservatives unhappy. They make Mr. Poilievre unhappy, perhaps, but they're all true. And those are all things that are part of his record. And so what the Liberal War Room is going to do, and what the New Democratic War Room is going to do, is take those things and turn them into ads and turn them into literature and tell the story of Pierre Poilievre. Because the Conservative Party, of its many mistakes in the past 7 months, they've made one mistake bigger than all the others. They have not defined Pierre Poilievre. They needed to define him before his opponents could define him. And I think that's what we're about to see, is we're going to see the Liberal War Room, the Liberal election machine, because it is the most successful electoral machine in Western democracy, define Pierre Poilievre. We're going to see the New Democrats do that. And to some extent, we're going to see them doing that because Poilievre has spent the last, well, not just the past 7 months, he spent his entirety of his political career attacking those of us in the media for having the temerity to be occasionally critical of him. So I think he is going to be facing an avalanche of scrutiny and critical commentary, and that's part of democracy. And I think it is going to have an impact on him. Already it is, I think it was Leger, who is the most accurate federal pollster, had a poll out just a few days ago when it became clear that Poilievre was, and it showed that the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, Brian, are tied where they have been since O'Toole. Poilievre has not moved the needle. He has not, as I said in what you just read, expanded the Conservative base. The Conservative Party is where it is. If there was a honeymoon, if there was a bubble that, some kind of a lift that Poilievre was going to get from the leadership race, it hasn't happened. And I think that it's going to be a pretty tough election campaign, and it's going to be a tough road to hoe for Mr. Poilievre.
Warren Kinsella of Daisy Group, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your thoughts on the election of Pierre Poilievre as leader of the Conservative Party and the impact on politics and the impact on Canada. That's our show for tonight, everyone. I want to thank both Warren Kinsella and Rick Anderson for joining me. I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years in Canadian politics. Frankly, maybe some of the most interesting couple of years in a long time. Stay with us. We're going to cover it as we go through. Thanks so much. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Warren.